Well, welcome to the show, Anthony. I'm excited to talk about all things breathwork and, of course, specifically how breathwork can help mountain athletes perform better. But before we get into all those details, which I think might be a little bit nerdy, which I always like to understand how people that I interview landed where they are, because I find that we all have had so many stops and starts and redirects in our lives and our careers. And it's just fascinating to be, especially because I think our kids, we're encouraged to pick one thing we want to be when we grow up. And as I get older, I find that that's just nobody's just one thing. Give us a little history of how you got where you are.
Well, Lisa, when I was a kid, I dreamt of being a breathwork coach. So I'm exactly where I planned. Yeah, right. No, I wanted to be a professional athlete, of course. Professional football player, and then I turned out 5'7" and 170 pounds.
That's a little rough,
soaking wet, and it just didn't cut it for me. But yeah, my journey, I would say it starts with me getting bit by the entrepreneurial bug when I was in college, and I did play football in college. So I made it that far with my athletic pursuits.
Farther than most kids make it with their professional athlete dreams.
Right. Thanks. Yeah, it was a very high level of Division III college football. But luckily, I had other things to kind of take me beyond my football career, and I got bit by that entrepreneurial bug. I started my first company while I was in college that brought me into the world of distilleries. So my first company, so appropriately in college, was a distillery.
You're really working towards your market.
Right, exactly. I ended up running a business with a co-founder for about 8 years that we started while we were in school and then took it out of school. And then shortly after my departure from that business, I had a very short stint in private equity as an operating partner. Maybe that part of it's a conversation for another day, but I learned what I didn't want to do with my professional career. And I think it was actually during that time period, through some personal struggles and some redirections, I guess you can call it. Personally, I think the universe has a funny way of telling us so loudly at times when we're not on the right track or not on the track that we're designed for.
It's soft at first, and then it hits you over the head. If you don't listen.
Yeah, exactly. So I got hit over the head a couple of times. And I think it was through those subtle nudges, we'll call them, that's when I stumbled on breathwork. And for me, I had been working on some form of mindfulness practice for me that I thought could work, tried meditation, tried a lot of different things, and it ended up being breathwork as the one that really worked for me. And beyond even just simple breathwork, it was combining breathwork with nature and adventure travel. And it was actually really on a sabbatical that I took just after my departure from private equity that I birthed this concept of my company now, Recal, short for recalibrate, for all the various types of recalibrations that one may need in their life. But the origins are in combining breathwork with nature and adventure travel to help people recalibrate their nervous system, their body, their mind. And so that's kind of like my stumbling, bumbling journey that's led me into my childhood dream of breathwork.
And I feel like I've done the same thing, right? And probably everyone does. You dabble in different mindfulness modalities to find one that actually sticks or works for you. Do you know what it was about breathwork and then the combination of breathwork and nature that really just resonated for you?
A lot of people dabble in mindfulness. I was certainly one of them. I am certainly one of them. I think it's still a continuous journey. But from a mindfulness practice standpoint, one of the challenges that I faced was I felt like my thoughts are a runaway train at times. And I really struggled to gain some level of presence with any sort of mindfulness practice. What I found with breathwork specifically was it's as if I slammed on the cheat code. Okay. I hit the cheat code button, and through breathwork training, and really for me, the introductory breathwork was the Wim Hof method. And it's actually kind of interesting. My sabbatical that I mentioned lightly there a second ago, it took me off into the mountains, into nature for about 60 days of just pure quiet. I mean, I disappeared off the face of the earth. I deleted every app on my phone. If you ever want a more cleansing thing in this modern world that we live in, it's delete every app on your phone.
Double click on that for a second. Were you initially like panicked? Like, I imagine I would be, our nervous system is so used to getting fulfilled by those things.
Yeah, it's a scary place to be when you eliminate that type of constant stimulation. And that
Yeah.
was really uncomfortable. I felt like that was something that it was discomfort that I felt like I needed to go through. Yeah, I did. And I tried to go through that discomfort of quieting things down, quieting my world down, getting out into nature and practicing various types of meditation. And funny part, so to speak, I guess we could call it funny, was it wasn't until after my 60 days in some of the quietest places in the country. It was still somewhat COVID era, and I was camping in January out west in California and in Colorado and Nevada and all these different places in truly some of the quietest places in the world. In fact, fast forward a little bit, my company's worked with an organization called Quiet Parks International. They find the quietest places in the world, the ones least impacted by human-made noise. And I was in some of those, and I was practicing meditation and mindfulness. And what I found was I was bringing the noise. I was bringing the noise in my own head. And it wasn't until after I was on my drive back home, which at the time I was living in Minnesota, it wasn't until my drive back home that I stumbled on the Wim Hof method. And I pulled off to the side of the road at a rest stop somewhere in Nebraska, I think, maybe Iowa, not quite sure which one. And with all the traffic noise and everything, clearly not one of the quietest places in the world, I laid down, I did the Wim Hof method, and the quiet that I was able to achieve in my mind in that moment was beyond anything I'd experienced in those 60 days out in nature. So that was my true, I call Wim Hof method my gateway drug. That was the moment that I recognized the power of breathwork. And I've kind of been on a mission ever since that's led me down this deep rabbit hole of breathwork training for all sorts of applications and delivering those to people to help them in the various ways that they're looking for help.
That's amazing. And I love, like, I would say it was, you needed those 60 days to get quiet enough to be ready for that type of breath work to have that impact on you. I imagine if you'd done it on day 40, maybe nothing would have happened. It's always interesting to me how what we've been doing leads us to exactly where we are. And we sometimes don't connect all those dots at first. So in that moment, we talk about mindfulness a lot. I've had a couple of episodes about mindfulness. What does it mean to you when you were sitting there? I imagine you thought, and like the first time I had one of those moments, I was like, holy shit, don't piss off. Don't breathe differently. Don't move differently. Like, this is how it's supposed to be. And what was it like for you? And what does mindfulness mean to you today?
Mindfulness is a tricky, finicky little thing. So you're right. When we actually catch that moment where we think we're living in this mindful moment, like, don't do anything different. You got to hold on to it. Well, my answer to that's going to be addressing what is the nature of all things being temporary. But anyway, before I get into that part of the answer, I think high level mindfulness to me just means being present in the moment. For me, not swept up in that runaway train of thoughts and maybe the subsequent emotions and everything that comes with thoughts. I think beyond being simply present, it's the ability to separate self from thought.
Yes.
And that, I think, is, to me, what mindfulness is. I had an interesting experience last year doing a Vipassana in India. I did a Vipassana, which
I've done that before too. The hardest thing, I mean, I know people will be like, how could that be harder than climbing K2? I will tell you, being silent for 7 days, really hard.
I totally agree with you. It really was a challenge. And so, yeah, I was in India. I was doing that traditional Vipassana, which happened to be 10 days for me, silent, meditating 10 hours each day for 10 days. And my key takeaways from that experience were exactly what I was referencing a second ago, which is all things are temporary. So that pain that you're feeling in your foot, or in my case, my knee, I had excruciating knee pain, the itch that you feel on the back of your neck, or even that thought that's coming up, or the emotions tied to that thought, all of that is temporary. And the second finding I think that I got from that experience at Vipassana was that your mind and thoughts are what can have power over you in any given moment. They're either going to pull you toward something pleasurable, or they're going to push you away from something potentially painful. And what I witnessed in those 10 days, or maybe what I was challenged by in those 10 days most, was how in the world do I sit for 10 hours a day in pain, or with it being nice outside and thinking that sounds really pleasurable, I want to get the hell up from this seat pillow that I'm sitting on and get out there. How can I sit in between both of those things, pleasure on one hand, pain on the other, and sit in the middle in equanimity and just observing and not reacting? And to me, somewhere in the middle of those things, just observing, not reacting, is that ideal state of a mindfulness practice.
And we are so reactive in this culture for sure. And in fact,
Hey,
I
there's our
think
breath work for that. No,
yes.
just kidding.
And that's often rewarded, I think, the ability to
Yeah.
be reactive and to, I don't want to say that thinking critically is negative, but sometimes I've found when I want to jump into something and react and control, it's a much better outcome when I just stop and go for a run or walk away and then come back to it with a much more level head. But I think that's not, in our culture, that's not rewarded. It's not like if you're in a business meeting, I mean, we both worked in intense corporate environments. It's not like you can say in a business meeting, I need to go for a walk and I'll come back and
Right.
then we'll work on this. Like it's just, that's
Right.
not accepted.
You might not be able to do that during a business meeting, but let me share with you a little breath work that maybe you could do in a business meeting.
Please, I'm all ears.
Completely unscripted
all
here,
ears.
right? Okay.
Yeah.
This comes from a Dutch gentleman by the name of Casper van der Meulen, and he
I
focuses
know
on...
him.
Oh, you do?
Yeah,
Of course you do.
I found him, but I follow him. Yeah, he's great.
Yeah, he's all things breathwork and high optimization, I would say. And he's done some really crazy endurance events before and even recovered from this insane, almost tragic surgery that he faced by doing breathwork. It's really fascinating. He brings a whole new level of like the mind-body connection to things. So he has this one particular breath work protocol, which is designed for that exact moment. If you're in a business meeting or somewhere where you need to be covert and you can't say, hey, I need to take a walk, and you have to work with those emotions that is just flooding into your system in that particular moment. He calls it the one breath break. Break is in slamming on the brakes on your nervous system. So break, B-R-A-K-E. And the way that it works is you take a very quick inhale through the nose, a full inhale. Hopefully it's fairly inconspicuous so no one really notices that. He would recommend hold on to it for as long as you kind of maybe can in that moment, which maybe that's 15 seconds given probably your increased heart rate. I find actually not to hold on to it for as long as I can because I think that might introduce more stress. I actually invite someone to just hold on to it for like 5 to 7 seconds. So you're just holding your breath there. Take that moment to look inward and feel your heartbeat. Because when you take an inhale, or you hold after an inhale, you're actually increasing your heart rate in that particular moment. There's a lot of science behind that, which I could get into, and we can if you want, but just work with me on the fact that when you inhale and you inhale, hold, you're increasing your heart rate. In that moment, you just observe that heart rate. After those 5 to 7 seconds of holding after the inhale, you then exhale for basically as long as you possibly can. And what that extended exhale is going to do is it's going to downshift your nervous system. It's going to do the opposite to what that increased heart rate of that inhale breath is going to do. It downshifts the nervous system. And if you can extend your exhale for as long as you can, that's going to resettle everything. You literally just slammed on the brakes on your nervous system in that moment. So that's an inconspicuous way, sitting in that business meeting or other situation. Maybe you got cut off on the road or something, and you're all of a sudden really mad at the person that cut you off while driving. The one breath break is slamming on the brakes, not on the vehicle there, but on your nervous system.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that. I'm going to keep that, especially when I'm driving. It makes me the most ragey for some reason. A yoga teacher once, or I don't know, somewhere I heard this, that, we search for all these tools to improve ourselves or reduce stress. And our breath is the one thing that we always have with us all the time. And this tool is a perfect example of that. You could employ that in any setting. It probably takes 5 or 10 seconds and it gives you a little reset.
Exactly.
So,
breath is always with you.
Yes. I think we forget about that. We forget that it's this tool we have. We take it for granted. I take it for granted. And we forget that it's something we can actually use all the time to help us. So let's get into high altitude breathwork training. How did you go from Wim Hof in this moment on the side of the highway in Nebraska to now this program that you have that helps people who are traveling to altitude, including mountain athletes, prepare and perform better for that endeavor?
What, that's not a natural progression? That doesn't.
I mean, maybe you were sitting there with Wim Hof, like,
no.
Ding, ding, I got it.
Yeah, that was my epiphany moment there on the side of the highway, was exactly that. That moment was just the inlet to, oh, wow, breathwork has the power to change your state at any moment in time. And actually, even to back up 1 second here, like you said, breath's always with you, and people are always looking for tools and how to show up best for every moment that they want to show up for. And it's interesting, our world is full of these stimuli and these stressors. And I really look at it like our hardwiring of our bodies and our minds are not really designed for the modern world in which we live in. In fact, this is something called the mismatch theory of evolution.
Which I had to look up. I had not heard of this. So please enlighten all of us.
Well, I don't know exactly who coined the phrase, but at least where I've heard the phrase from is a gentleman named Daniel Lieberman. He's a Harvard researcher, anthropologist, and he wrote a book, quite a few books, but one of them in particular, it's The Story of the Human Body, I think is more notable books. And in that he talks about the mismatch theory of evolution. And it's basically just to say that over thousands of years out in nature, out in these very natural environments, our bodies adapted. And so all of the systems and functions of our body adapted to that type of external environment. And what's happened recently, in terms of recency, as in the last few hundred years, really, I guess you could date it back to when we started to switch from hunter-gatherer societies into farming cultures, but really with the boom of industrial revolution and now this digital information age that we live in, the modern environment which humans find ourselves having stumbled into is really at a mismatch between the systems of our body. And I'm going to focus just on the breath here to give you an example. Of course, breathwork guy is going to talk about breathing. But for example, the modern human today, we take anywhere between 20 and 25,000 breaths a day. And what that comes out to is, on average, that can be anywhere between 12 and 20 breaths per minute. A lot of us hover around 16 to 18. If you wear like a Whoop or something that gives you some biometric feedback on your respiratory rate per minute, you might be around 16 to 18 breaths per minute. Do you know the most optimal respiratory rate in terms of both gas exchange and getting an optimal level of oxygen in, but also for heart rate and stress control? Do you have any idea what the most optimal respiratory rate is?
It's lower than whatever our average is.
The wonderful guess. Yeah, it is lower. It's not higher. It is lower than that, 16 to 18 range. In fact, it's roughly 1/3 to 1/2 of what most humans are doing today. Yes, 6 breaths per minute.
Think about that for a second.
Yes.
A third.
It's really, really incredible how far we've come. And I do look at the external environment and the mismatch that it is. Again, the stressors, the stimuli, the absolute information overload that we consume in a day versus what our ancestors would consume in their entire life. It's really crazy. And so that has an impact on our entire being. And what comes out and what comes through is a heightened respiratory rate. And so that is something that I'm looking to hopefully help people bring awareness to and help change through the breath. Now, the origins again of my company, and when I did that Wim Hof method session and the subsequent months after that, I wanted to help people recalibrate their mind and their body, and using breathwork as a tool to help them recalibrate. And I kept things really wide open because I wanted the most organic thing to emerge from my company. And so what we started with was doing these mindfulness plus adventure retreats, quietest places in the world. As I mentioned, yes, it was through a partnership with Quiet Parks International. We ran some retreats out in nature and we practiced breathwork in places that probably felt like home for our bodies. That's kind of how I looked at it. And the breathwork helped get people present in those places of home, out from their modern environments in which they live. And the more and more that I got into this rabbit hole of breathwork, the more I saw its multiple applications. And sticking true to the origin, the vision of bringing breathwork to the table and adventure travel for people to get out into nature and do some amazing things, what I just continued to gravitate toward, maybe it was my athletic background, I gravitated a little bit less from the more woo-woo applications in breathwork. And I have a ton of respect. I personally have been through some incredible breathwork experiences with some of the best practitioners in the world of that very deep spiritual experience subset of people. For me, I think I just gravitated a little bit more naturally toward breathwork for sport and performance. And through that rabbit hole, I went beyond the Wim Hof method and into something called Oxygen Advantage, an organization that was founded by a guy named Patrick McKeown based in Ireland. He's a descendant, so to speak, of Konstantin Buteyko from the Buteyko Clinic. And that's breathwork protocols for asthma and really health-related things. And what Patrick did was bring both the health-related ways to have breathwork address health. He really brought it to sport and performance as well. And through that was high-altitude simulation breathwork. And so this natural or more organic progression that happened as I went deeper and deeper into the rabbit hole of breathwork training was into how breathwork can be applied to enable somebody to climb a mountain through really a few different areas, which is high altitude simulation breathwork protocols, as well as respiratory muscle training. And on top of that, it kind of cloaked around everything is proper breathing mechanics. And
just day-to-day breathing.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's get those breathing habits correct to start with. Yeah. So that became the newfound focus. And now with this new focus, we've even recently launched a high altitude breathwork training program that helps mountain athletes achieve their high altitude endeavors. And yeah, so we just recently even launched a 5-week, what we call pre-acclimatization breathwork training program,
which I loosely followed. I will say I have to go back, have a do-over. I find there's so many things I want to dig into there. I want to get into the high altitude, obviously, that training, but let's just talk about day-to-day breathing.
Mm-hmm.
What are we getting wrong, or what are things we should be paying attention to when we're just hanging out with our kids or chilling by the pool?
The first, most immediate thing that you can do starting right now is really 2 things I'll focus on. Number 1, shut your mouth, breathe through your nose. The nose, it's adapted to handle all of our breathing.
Right.
And somewhere along the way, stumbling into the modern society that we're in, we started breathing with our mouth. And it's just not designed for it. We think, oh, it's a bigger airway. That means we can get more air in. Well, paradoxically, I guess you could say, it's not actually necessarily great to breathe more all the time. And one of the primary reasons for that is that on its way into our lungs, air passes through different cavities and spaces. We call those spaces dead space. And if you actually breathe more at a rate of, say, that upper range of 18 to 20 breaths per minute, you're actually exacerbating the quote unquote issue that is the dead space. And you're likely breathing up in your upper chest area. And that's not where the majority of gas exchange, oxygen into the bloodstream, actually occurs. 70% or so of our gas exchange actually happens in the bottom branches of our bronchioles, 17 through 23. That's the bottom parts of our lungs. So we want to breathe through the nose, and we want to breathe slow. I always look at it as nose, slow, and low. And I certainly can't take credit for this. This is from Patrick in Oxygen Advantage. Breathe through the nose, breathe slow, and breathe low into the diaphragm. Those are the simplest, most straightforward things you can do starting now that it will fix your breathing mechanics.
And you should feel your belly rising, right? Is that a way to know that you're breathing lowly in the lower part of your lungs?
Yep. Feel the belly rise. And I would take one small step even further than that. You want to feel your rib cage expand 360 degrees around.
Right.
So not even just the belly moving forward and outward in front of you. You want to feel 360 degrees movement with the bottom part of your rib cage.
Man, do I have some work to do.
Right. This second run, I appreciate your honesty. I really respect that, by the way. The second run of the program, we're gonna get things dialed in and get it right.
I've had people tell me I naturally just breathe very shallowly, which I think is probably true. So this really is it's not a technique, but a good practice for me to start to change. Mm-hmm. And then it amazes me that I've climbed these big mountains breathing inefficiently.
You took the words right out of my mouth. All the more credit to you that you were able to go to that type of height with quote unquote, your words, not mine, shallow breathing.
Yeah, look out when I get it figured out. We'll be
exactly
running up there. That is something I personally want to start to do because I think it makes a big difference, not just obviously in gas exchange and oxygenation, but probably in calming us down as well. If we're breathing more slowly, more mindfully, it just seems like that our breath connects everything.
Absolutely, it does. And I call breath the bridge. Breath is the bridge between your mind and your body. And across that bridge, we can decide how it is that we cross it. But if we just do a few things different with our breath, it's going to result in stress levels and so many different really tangible outcomes.
Very good. So that's foundationally. So you've developed this program for people who are adventuring at altitude to follow ahead of their adventure. And it helps them acclimate, but also train their respiratory muscles to be stronger so that they can perform better when they're at elevation. Walk us through that, or tell us what that's about and why it's beneficial. And
Yeah.
And
So the first thing that I want to say right out of the gate is just a bit of a cautionary note. And that is number one, first and foremost, can't emphasize this enough. There is no substitute to acclimatization time on the mountain itself. I want to make that extremely clear. People, take your time, go slow, hike high, sleep low, do the things. Do the
yes.
local guidance. Do not skip out on the acclimatization time on the mountain. Now, if you're looking for a pre-acclimatization addition to the training that you're doing already, that's where a high altitude breathwork training program can come in. And there are major results that not only we've seen in the research that's been done over the years, but now what I kind of view myself as is kind of the conduit or the connector between the research in the field, the science, and everything that's been happening over the years in that realm and the practical application for the mountain athlete. That's really how I view my role in this. And so, yes, like you said, we've created a program. And I look at it as having 3 different steps to this program. The first one is something we already just hit on, which is improve your breath efficiency. And that's by breathing nose, slow, and low, getting those mechanics correct. Because if we look at what happens to somebody when they arrive at altitude, let's just take a moment and just what happens to your body when you arrive at altitude, right? The very first thing you may notice is you start to breathe faster. Your respiratory rate goes up. You feel somewhat out of breath as well, most likely. This is a result of the fact that for each inhaled breath, you're bringing in less oxygen. The partial pressure of oxygen is lower at altitude. The partial pressure of the air in general is lower. Therefore, for each volume of air that you're bringing in less molecules of oxygen.
Because those molecules are further spread out in a given space. So
exactly,
as you inhale, there's less of them available to you.
Boom. You know that all too well.
Boyle's law.
Right, exactly. So the body is going to react, and it's going to react in a lot of different ways, which is also why I recommend no matter what, spend time for the acclimatization time. But from a respiratory standpoint, there are some things that we can do that's going to help us out with the fact that you're bringing in less oxygen. And that starts with getting your breathing mechanics correct. If you are a shallow breather, and you breathe through your mouth and you're basically leaving a lot of air, even in those dead spaces in your nose, on your way down into your lungs, you're leaving so much of the limited oxygen on the table, so to speak, to get diffused into your bloodstream, right? So we want to get the mechanics correct. What happens naturally at altitude with someone increasing the respiratory rate is by design supposed to be good, but if your breathing mechanics are not good, it's actually going to
make it worse,
heighten the problem. Right, exactly. So step 1 is to get the breathing mechanics dialed in and correct. Now, parts 2 of 3 of our breathwork training program are really where the fun begins. Okay, we got the boring stuff out of the way, get the breathing mechanics down right. Now we get into the juicy, sexy, awesome, and also really fucking hard side of the training.
Thank you for saying it. Makes my ego feel better to hear that.
Right. Yeah. If you thought that was hard, you are not alone. Making these adaptations manually is challenging work. And so this training is tough. It's very tough, but there's major benefits that can come out of it. And so there's 2 key areas that we focus on in the training. The first one is to make adaptations in your body using high altitude simulation breathwork protocols. And I will get into a little bit more of the science of what those breathwork protocols are, but those adaptations that we're looking to make are really twofold. The first one is we're going to train your carbon dioxide tolerance so that you feel less breathless on the mountain. There's a common misconception out there, and that is when someone feels out of breath, it's that they don't have enough oxygen in that moment. Most likely, 99 times out of 100, that's not the case. In fact, if you're wearing a pulse oximeter and you're working out and you're feeling breathless, most likely the SpO2 that you're showing, the oxygen saturation of your blood, is most likely still in that 95 to 99 range. You're good. What that feeling of breathlessness really is caused by is the increase in carbon dioxide in the blood. Carbon dioxide is a byproduct of cellular respiration. So it's your typical metabolism process. And if you are working at higher levels of intensity, you're metabolizing more, you're producing more ATP, which produces the energy that it takes to move. And the byproduct of that's carbon dioxide. So your CO2 levels go up. So what we're going to work on, that first adaptation we're going to work on, is to manually change the chemoreceptor sensitivity that you have toward carbon dioxide so that you feel less breathless, so that you can maintain breathing nose slow and low on the mountain.
So given that, this is applicable not just for people who are venturing at altitude. It seems like it's good just day to day, right? Even if you're a weekend athlete or you want to go play basketball with your kids and feel good, or with the, dads in your neighborhood and smoke them on the basketball court or the tennis court or whatever, it seems like this would be beneficial in multiple applications.
That's right. The sea level dwelling basketball dads can absolutely benefit from this as well. I know that the high altitude mountains get like the sexy cachet, but
Right.
really, this is at the end of the day, the benefits span way beyond the mountain and in your everyday life. So, absolutely. So, that's adaptation number one is CO2 tolerance. Can we change our chemoreceptor sensitivity to carbon dioxide so that we can feel less breathless and therefore breathe more optimally through the nose, slow and low? Now, the second adaptation that we focus on making is increasing our hemoglobin concentration. So that's increasing the amount of red blood cells that we have in our body before we show up on the mountain, which, by the way, is typically your byproduct of being on the mountain. Acclimatization, it
Right.
takes time. One of the reasons why that takes time is the body is actually making more red blood cells. You can kickstart that process at sea level through high altitude simulation breathwork training. This has been shown in the science. For example, using a breathwork protocol that's called intermittent hypoxic hypercapnic training, IHHT. The research has shown in many studies, one in particular, though, that over the course of a 6 to 8 week training program, you can actually increase your hemoglobin concentration by 5.35%. That's
It's a
very
lot.
significant. It is. And what that results in is actually an over 10% increase in somebody's VO2 max, your total oxygen uptake. So you can change your hemoglobin concentration and the subsequent VO2 max by doing high altitude simulation training protocols, in particular this intermittent hypoxic hypercapnic training. Now, the benefits of that may be obvious, of course. In that realm of adaptation, you're showing up to the mountain with more red blood cells than you had before.
Who doesn't want that?
I certainly do and did, and I'm happy that I did in some of my own
And
endeavors.
it's the same physiological process, right? You're causing your body to produce more EPO, which is in turn then causing you to build more red blood cells. So you're not short-circuiting physiology here. It's the same thing that happens when you're in the mountains. It's the same physiological process.
My answer to that is, from what I know, yes, that is true. I still think that there is some gray area and some unknowns to some of the underlying mechanics of why this works. Because, and here's what I'll say on that. There are people that have done purely free diving, hypoxic oriented breathwork training
Sure.
protocols. And for a limited amount of time, likely through spleen compression, that increases the hemoglobin concentration, but those levels actually go back down within a matter of hours.
Interesting.
So spleen contraction can be done through hypoxic breathwork training. So that's breath holds. If you just hold your breath for as long as you can actually contract the spleen. That produces more red blood cells, at least just in the moment. That's kind of like your survival instinct from the body. If it's running out of oxygen, the spleen holds a reserve of red blood cells and it will contract and let those go out into the system. But what the research has shown is that comes back into the spleen after a short amount of time. So your everyday typical hypoxic spleen contraction oriented breath protocol actually has not necessarily been shown to be beneficial on the mountain because, again, those red blood cells, they're going back into the spleen. So what we're looking for is more long-term red blood cell count increases. And that's where a more active form of high altitude simulation breathwork protocol has been shown to be effective. And that's specifically that intermittent hypoxic, so that is low oxygen, but plus hypercapnic, which means high carbon dioxide. Cap is like the Latin stem, whatever that is exactly. I didn't study Latin, but hypercapnic means high CO2. It's that with a more active form of exercise that then has shown the results of more long-standing increase in hemoglobin concentration. And so I just lay that out because I still think that the underlying mechanism from a science standpoint has not been totally made clear, but there can be, beyond the splenic contraction, there can be a line drawn between the release of erythropoietin, EPO, and an increase in your red blood cell count. And most likely that's been shown to be a catalyst for longer term higher hemoglobin concentration. And so just to clarify that, just to apply a little bit of science and explain that, when you hold your breath for an extended period of time, your kidneys are going to release erythropoietin or EPO. And you may be familiar with that even from some of the cycling scandals. They take
we all know what
EPO
EPO is
artificially and that results in more red blood cells, which obviously results in higher VO2 max. And you can do that manually through high altitude simulation breathwork training, release EPO, and that will increase hemoglobin concentration. I just wanted to at least clarify that there is still some things to be figured out, but the results are there when done in a more active intermittent hypoxic hypercapnic training type of way.
And so what does the program look like? If someone is preparing to trek to Everest Base Camp, for example, and they live at sea level, and like all of us, you want to have every possible advantage you can, they should start doing this about 5 weeks before. And what's sort of walk us through the big milestones of the training?
Yeah, let's do that. So like I said, it is a 5-week program, which is, it fits nicely into maybe that last block of fitness training that you have right before going on your altitude endeavor. So the first 4 weeks out of the 5 are going to be really the bulk of your training, and it's going to increase in intensity each and every week. And then that 5th week is your taper week. So we don't want to tax the muscles at all, really, in that last week. But we do still make a final push toward hypoxic work and CO2 training in that week, just in a way that doesn't engage the muscles or tax the muscles too much. So it's basically a 4+1 type of framework. And what we start with are obviously some proper breathing mechanics type of work, because we need to clean that up first and foremost. And that is weaved into some of the more engaging or higher intensity type of high altitude simulation breathwork training that we do. But there is that third component, which I hadn't, I guess, mentioned before either, which is the respiratory muscle training. So yes, from a respiratory muscle training standpoint, that is strength training of both your inspiratory or your inhale muscles, as well as your expiratory or exhale muscles, which are somewhat similar, but they are distinct categories. So when you inhale, you're really engaging your diaphragm muscle, which is the dome-shaped muscle right underneath your lungs. And when that contracts, it flattens out. And what that does is it changes the thoracic pressure inside that space where your lungs are. And that pressure change is what's going to actually bring in the air. Now, why is it beneficial to have a stronger diaphragm when you're at altitude? And that comes down to the fact that there's lower pressure air at altitude. So if you think about it, high level, air moves from higher pressure space to a lower pressure space, high pressure to low pressure. If you are in a low pressure space, being high altitude, that means the air is not as easily going to move into your lung. So what you need is a strong diaphragm to be able to handle that increased workload, not just from the increased respiratory rate that you're experiencing at altitude, because you're going to breathe more times. So the diaphragm is going to need to work harder. It's going to work doubly hard because it needs to literally pull in the air from that lower pressure volume of space into your lungs. So we train the inspiratory muscles, primarily your diaphragm, as well as your outer intercostal muscles. I always need to think when I say that. Your outer intercostal muscles. The intercostal muscles are the muscles in between each rib bone in your rib cage. So that's on the inspiratory. On the expiratory side of things, you're really engaging your abdomen muscles in general, as well as your inner intercostal muscles for the expiration. So what we do is we have a series of exercises that are in the respiratory muscle training field. And so we train those muscles. And from the research, again, just citing a bit of research that's out there. So in this particular study, they looked at inspiratory muscle training, IMT, which is a subset of respiratory muscle training, of course. And somebody that trained with IMT before heading to altitude, what they experienced was upwards of 10% increase in their oxygen saturation levels at a 4,800 meter and above level. So this is very high altitude. We're talking 4,800 meters or above. There wasn't a major difference at altitude levels below that between the control group and then the subset that actually did the inspiratory muscle training. But when they went to a level that was very low pressure air, 4,800 meters and above, that's where they saw the biggest jump in their SpO2. And that was upwards of 10%.
Just by training their muscles to be stronger and therefore to be able to inhale more efficiently, or just more?
Not necessarily more, because remember, we want to, especially at times of rest on the mountain, we want to keep things nose slow and low. So it's not necessarily a matter of more. I don't know that I can speak to the underlying reason why. There were two tangible outcomes from inspiratory muscle training in this particular study. The first one is a little metric called MIP, maximum inhalation pressure, MIP. It's basically how strong can you inhale? And before the inspiratory muscle training versus after, they experienced a 15% increase in somebody's MIP. Again, that's a metric on your strength of your inhale. And the second thing that they measured was the thickness of the diaphragm, which is an indication of the strength or the size or volume of your diaphragm. And that thickness increased, I want to say from memory, again, if we're going to link the research, then it'll show up. Maybe I'll prove to be wrong, but I believe it was 20% increase in the thickness of the diaphragm. And this was in only a 4 to 6 week, I think.
Wow.
Training program. So the results happen fast, which is again why we quote unquote only need 5 weeks worth of an acclimatization training program to prepare someone for the mountain. Of course, if you're like a pro athlete and running ultra marathons at altitude, the Kilian Jornets of the world, we can do more than 5 weeks together, right? But at least for the quote unquote like recreational athlete that's got an endeavor in the mountain, 5 weeks from the research and everything seems to be sufficient. So thicker diaphragm. So that means your diaphragm is stronger, well conditioned, as well as power that you have behind your inhale. That is increased. And for some reason or another, that means that you are diffusing more oxygen into your bloodstream than the control. And the average, I think, was 6% across the board for the IMT train group versus the other, in an increase in someone's SpO2, just using the standard like pulse oximeter at altitude. And I think on the higher end, it was 10% increase. And I mean, that's the difference. If you're at, that's a huge difference.
Huge.
I don't think I need to even emphasize that enough. That is really significant. So yeah, that is the third component to our RECALS high altitude breathwork training program is the respiratory muscle training. And so in week 1, for example, you're going to get to know the high altitude simulation breathwork training protocols, as well as some introductory respiratory muscle training. So there's really 2 sides. And what we do is at least there's 3 times a week, you should be doing both of those segments. So you can either do both respiratory muscle training exercises, which will take about 15 to 20 minutes, as well as your high altitude simulation exercises, which again takes 15 to 20 minutes, combined total of 30 to 40 minutes. You could do that 3 times a week, or you can alternate days if you want. So it's 15 to 20 minutes per day for 6 days, rest on the 7th day. So you keep with that cadence throughout the 4 weeks really of the intense portion of the training program. And then again, obviously that 5th week, then we enter taper week. And really there we focus on hypocapnic training. And we go hypocapnic, which means low carbon dioxide, so that we can actually extend our holds. So we go through breath hold training in that week. It's the Wim Hof method, essentially. So you do controlled hyperventilation. You're offloading carbon dioxide very quickly, because when you exhale, you're exhaling carbon dioxide. So you get rid of the carbon dioxide. Then you go into an exhale hold. So you exhale one last time, then you hold your breath after an exhale. What happens in that moment is over time through that breath hold, your oxygen levels are naturally going to drop at the same level that they typically would. But what's different about after hyperventilating and then holding is your carbon dioxide levels are going to take longer to rise. And therefore, your trigger to need to breathe is going to take a lot longer. And therefore you can hold your breath longer than you normally would. And through that very acute and targeted breathwork exercise, your body is going to make hypoxic adaptation. That's really where your EPO work comes in. We're going to release erythropoietin, and that's going to instigate the creation of new red blood cells from your bone marrow, which that catalyst process takes anywhere between 2 to 4 days or so for you to then create those new red blood cells. So we do some of that, and then we also make one last push for the carbon dioxide tolerance training as well. Yeah, I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I also think it's important to point out that you don't need any, like it's helpful to have something that will plug your nose, but you don't need any fancy equipment to do this, right? It's just your breath. And if you have stairs, that's a little bit easier. You could march in place. So I think it's important for people to know that too. This is very easy, even though I couldn't do it. It was yet. I couldn't do it yet.
Right.
It's a very easy thing to add on to your day. You can do it anywhere with anything.
I mean, by design, the breath is accessible. And so we created this program without the need for any additional equipment. There are a couple of pieces of equipment that may be helpful and can enhance your training if you decide to invest in that. And that's really in 2 particular areas. The first area is air resistance training. So you can get more out of your respiratory muscle training if you have air resistance. And that can be just as simple as blocking one nostril and just breathing through that one nostril. You're decreasing your airway by 50%. Of course, that's going to provide the air resistance. That's going to help train those respiratory muscles. But there are also other devices out there that are designed for this specific thing, air resistance. And then one other piece of equipment that is mandatory in the program is also very accessible, which is a balloon. And this is a part of the training that even you, I don't think, went through because we hadn't even added this to it. This has been a process of constant improvement, right? Because more research comes out, we're pulling from different areas, we're learning more as we go, getting more client feedback, and we continue to improve. Well, the latest iteration actually includes balloons as an expiratory muscle training bit of equipment. So you blow into a balloon, you're actually engaging that abdomen and your inner intercostal muscles, and you're going to build strength of that expiratory power, basically, with the average balloon.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. There's a few other pieces of optional equipment. There is a sports mask. A lot of times people ask me about, what about those high altitude masks? Those things are just full of shit, right?
Thank you for saying that, because I tell that the only benefit I see is that they may make your respiratory muscles stronger because it's more effort to breathe, but I don't see any benefit to those at all.
Here's what I say. It depends on really what you're using it for and what you're trying to get out of it, and keeping in mind what it is beneficial for and what it doesn't have anything to do with.
It's not going to get you acclimated to climb Everest.
Going to, right. Thank you. It is not going to mean that you don't need to acclimatize for Everest, but there are two key benefits to these devices. The first one, as you mentioned, was air resistance. It is going to provide air resistance, particularly on your inhale, and that is going to build your diaphragm and your outer intercostal muscles. So it is beneficial for that. But there is a second thing that it's beneficial for, and that is that if you do keep that on while exercising, there's an exercise actually even in our training program called Breathe Light Hiking, where you hike and you try to slow down your respiratory rate while hiking. If you wear that sports mask, you're going to pool carbon dioxide. You're going to keep carbon dioxide right there near your nose. So for every inhaled breath, you're actually going to be bringing in more carbon dioxide than you would normally. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere around us at sea level is like 0.4%. By using a sports mask, you can increase that tenfold to 4%. And that is going to help train your carbon dioxide tolerance. Is it going to be the magic bullet that you need to go climb Everest? No way. Hell no, it's not. Same with other devices that are out there like Hypoxico tents, which I'm a fan of, to a certain degree. It does lower the oxygen pressure. These are tents, of course, that someone can either sleep in or, I've seen exercise them with around their desks at their office, exercise with. Exactly.
I've done all those things. Yes.
Okay. And, across the spectrum of things that I look at as what you may need before climbing a mountain, if there's 10 things, that might cover like 0.5 of the 10 or 1 of the 10. It's a very passive way to introduce a hypoxic environment, and that is going to make some adaptations in your body. We, through breathwork training, are more focused on the active forms of adaptation. And this is, we're in really the business of like manual changes. But, along the way, our breathwork training program is trying to cover as much of the 10 things that you need across that spectrum. And again, I think that something like a mask and something like a Hypoxico tent, those cover, a little sliver of the full spectrum. And we're trying to cover as much as is accessible for somebody at sea level. And as I mentioned at the beginning, you cannot do all 10 things necessarily at sea level, but we can give you tools to maybe cover 7, 8 of the 10, something in that range, but never replace, of course, acclimatization time on the mountain itself.
And the hypoxic training or sleeping, I would imagine, doesn't train your respiratory muscles, because maybe if you train with it, do you think it does? You're on a bike with it?
I still would say generally no. And that is because I look at respiratory muscle training specifically as having two sides. Either you have air resistance or you have weight resistance. And I didn't mention that either, but one of the exercises that we do is lay on the ground and you take deep breaths and you have a little bit of weight on that diaphragm. Or you can use a resistance band around your diaphragm, or something called a Buteyko belt, which is designed for this specifically from Oxygen Advantage. And that provides physical resistance to your diaphragm and your intercostal muscles to continue to build the strength. And so through air resistance as well as weighted resistance, that's where I think you get the greatest movement progress
Right.
forward in your respiratory muscle training. Maybe, with the lower levels of oxygen, your body is going to kick in that increased respiratory rate. So you may breathe more often, which does help, of course, to condition the muscles to a certain degree, but it's not quite as targeted. And I don't feel that it's as effective.
Well, you've convinced me that I need to give the training another go for sure. And I imagine it feels like just something I'd want to do every day. So for someone who's maybe gone through the 5 weeks and they're like, yeah, I really see all these benefits and notice a difference. Is there some sort of maintenance that you recommend for people to follow on an ongoing basis?
Good point. So yeah, of course, we have the 5-week program, which leads someone up to their mountain endeavor, but what the heck do they do when they're back? And that's interesting because just recently, somebody, a client of mine who just got back from, I think it was Mount Rainier, and they provided me with some feedback about, okay, now what?
Right.
Right? What are the maintenance? And that's interesting. It's something that I hadn't quite packed into the program just yet. The first and foremost thing that I would recommend doing is you did the hard work of, in particular, building your carbon dioxide tolerance. This is probably one of the things that someone will notice first and most, and it is the most lasting thing, is feeling less breathless while you exercise at high levels of intensity. You're going to enjoy that. Trust me. And so you did the work of manually changing your chemoreceptor sensitivity to carbon dioxide. And so let's keep your CO2 tolerance high. And one of the exercises that you can do that is something called Breathe Light. So from a maintenance standpoint, I would recommend doing Breathe Light exercise at least 2 times per week. And in fact, if we want to, I can actually even guide you through live here.
Let's do it.
A little snippet of Breathe Light. And then the second thing for maintenance, and I will do that. So yes, we'll do that in a moment. The second thing that I'll mention for maintenance is actually being able to track your breathing over time. And a part of our training program is we introduce these breath assessments, and there's 3 of them that we focus on in the training. One of them is called the BOLT score, which stands for Body Oxygen Level Test. The second one is a CO2 TT, or carbon dioxide tolerance test.
And mine were both very low.
Right. Well, you're not alone. You're not alone. Especially, I was going to say, even if you live at sea level, sometimes these can be low because it's just so easy to breathe at sea level.
It's so easy here.
And the third one is a maximum breathlessness test, or MBT. And there are multiple reasons, not just where you live, but there can be genetic dispositions, some geared more toward having better scores on this versus others. And your breathing mechanics and how you breathe on an everyday basis likely contributes a lot to what these assessments look like for you. So I would say in maintenance would be, number 1, keep up with the breath assessments so that you're actually tracking how you're doing. And are you maintaining some reasonable level of what you did, toward the end of your training on breath assessments? And then if not, then you can deploy the Breathe Light exercise, for example, or some of the other exercises that you learned in the training. So that would be how I would recommend some maintenance. But yeah, why don't we right now live?
Yeah. So if people are driving, should they not do this?
Yeah. So from a warning standpoint, we're going to do 2 things. We're going to do a breath assessment, and then we're going to do Breathe Light. It's not even a recommendation. It's an absolute no, don't do it. Number 1, do not be driving. So if you're listening to this while driving, carry on with your normal breathing. Please.
Go back to this point in the podcast.
Yeah. Just bookmark this moment. Do this after you've stopped. Just like I did by pulling off to the side of the road, doing my Wim Hof method breathing. Pull over and do this, or do this only until you've reached your parking spot or whatever it is. Also, do not do this if you are on or near water. This particular set of exercises is not that risky for, potentially like passing out, for example. But if we were to do something like a controlled hyperventilation, like a Wim Hof method, or intermittent hypoxic hypercapnic even, we do not want to do that on or near water. And remember how I mentioned when you hyperventilate and in a controlled way, and you offload CO2 very quickly, and then when you go into the breath hold, it's going to take a lot longer for you to feel that trigger to breathe because carbon dioxide takes longer to come back into the system. Do not hyperventilate, then go into water. That is something that's proven to be very dangerous, and it has caused deaths. That is called shallow water blackout. People find that it's really cool to test how far they can swim underwater after hyperventilating. And truly, it's a huge no-no. So just a couple of warnings out there, as well as if you are pregnant, I do not recommend that you do the Breathe Light exercise that I'm about to guide you through. There are some other exercises in our training that you can do if you're pregnant and some that you cannot. So if you're pregnant, I would just be particularly keen on those cautionary notes we have in the training.
Got it.
Okay.
I'm
All
good.
right.
I'm good to do it. I'm none of
So,
those things right now.
okay, great. So we can move forward. What we're going to do together is the carbon dioxide tolerance test, or CO2 TT for short. The way that you do this breath assessment is we're going to take 3 normal breaths together, which is a normal inhale and a normal exhale, 3 times. After that third exhale, you're then going to take a really deep inhale to fill up your lungs as much as you possibly can. This is, on top of it being a carbon dioxide tolerance test, it's also a bit of a lung capacity test as well, or lung volume test. So you're going to bring in as much air as you possibly can. And then when you've reached the top of your inhale, you're going to begin a very, very, very slow exhale. You're going to try to extend the exhale as long as you possibly can through your nose, ideally. Maybe even if you're into Ujjayi breathing, engage a slight throat block where you provide some resistance in your throat. If you're into that, if not, just try to exhale as lightly and slowly as possible through your nose. You're going for time. I will start a timer on my end, and I'll be maybe shouting out the time every 5 to 10 seconds that you can track. And when we're done, I'll then spill the beans on what your time may mean. But for now, let's just go ahead and clear your mind. Sit up
No
straight.
pressure.
Relax your body. There is no pressure. Exactly. We're going to take 3 normal breaths together. So go ahead and take a normal inhale through your nose and a normal exhale through your nose. That's 1. Go ahead and take another inhale and a normal exhale. Just relax as you exhale. This will be our last breath. Go ahead and inhale normally. Exhale normally. And now go ahead and start that deep inhale. Bring in as much air as you can. Fill up your lungs. Fill up, fill up, fill up. And now begin that slow exhale. It's as if the air is just trickling out of your nose. We're at 10 seconds. Just let the air slowly go out. 15, 20 seconds. As you exhale, just relax your body. 25 seconds. Clearing your mind. 30 seconds. 35. 40. You're going to get to the point that you're squeezing all the air out of your lungs. 45. 50. And if you're done, you can
50.
take a normal breath. Nice. 55. I'll keep the timer going for those of you out there that are maybe still going. We're at 60 seconds. Great job. Again, you get to the point that you squeeze all the air out of your lungs. 65. We'll go for 5 more seconds on the timer. And 70. If you are still going, you are amazing. I'll go ahead and stop the timer there. So that is how a carbon dioxide tolerance test works. It's how long can you extend that exhale for, and along the way, work with that stress of the feeling of breathlessness. So what does this mean, right? If you are below 30 seconds, it either means A, that you're at really high altitude right this second when you're doing the assessment, and that completely threw off your score.
Asterisk.
Yeah, which is a factor. So when doing breath assessments, you always want to take note of what your elevation is, because that does play a role. So I always say this is not absolute. It's not like if you have this number, therefore you are bad at breathing. There can be other factors. You may also have had caffeine so far today, and that throws off a breath assessment score. So we always want to do breath assessments early in the morning, maybe before we've had food or caffeine, and you want to get consistent across where you are in the world when you're training so that we can actually track progress and not necessarily some absolute number to achieve. But really, if you're below 30, that is most likely a sign that you have some level of dysfunction to your breathing. That's a technical term, not my term. Some level of dysfunction to the breathing. And we have some things that we can clean up. If you're between 30 and 60, you still have signs of dysfunction to the breathing, and we can fix some things, but you're at least in that like low middle range on the spectrum. 60 is that threshold where we want you to get to at least 60 in a training program. If you are at 75, 80, 90 even,
Wow.
that's reaching an elite level, and I feel really good about your carbon dioxide tolerance. And most likely you can maintain nasal breathing through really high levels of intensity of exercise. And ultimately that's a big part of our goal here, is to maintain nose slow and low for as high of an intensity levels as possible. So yeah, that's kind of the range on that breath assessment.
I think that's fascinating. And you really have convinced me in this conversation that this is something I want to pick back up, because I think even though I don't have any high altitude plans right now, I think there's a lot of benefit to doing it just on a daily basis and being a more efficient breather as an athlete. I see huge benefits to that. So thank you.
Absolutely. Yes.
And thanks for all the tools. I love being able to share those with people. Before we go, can you share your daily breathwork practice? What do you do every day?
Sure. I'm happy to. So you're saying, what did I do right before hopping onto this super intense, anxiety-inducing podcast recording?
That's right.
So what I did this morning, and what I find myself doing often, actually, is something that I call the Huberman sequence. And I don't know that anybody else is calling it this. I don't even think Andrew Huberman himself is calling this. But I pieced together, like you may catch a theme from me, I pieced together some research and science-backed type of protocols with a practical application in the real world. And so my Huberman sequence sort of creation it was inspired by Andrew Huberman, and in particular, one of his breathwork protocols called the physiological sigh. It's not necessarily his, but he certainly talks a lot about this. And a physiological sigh is basically a double inhale through the nose and an exhale through the mouth. So you take a normal inhale through your nose, and then a small pause, and then a sniff in again, and then an exhale through the mouth. This has been shown through science to offload carbon dioxide very, very quickly, which also then down regulates there's often a correlation between your CO2 levels and your stress levels. So that breathless feeling and stress, of course. And oftentimes, if we're sitting in front of our computer and we're reading an email that just stresses us out, we may not even notice it, but we stop breathing. That increases the CO2 levels in the blood, which further makes us feel stressed, right? So I do a series of 4 of those. And for everybody out there, I recommend not doing necessarily more than 4 unless you're trying to do a very specific hypocapnic type of breathwork training, which is of the Wim Hof method hyperventilation field. So I do 4 of those, and then I go right after the physiological size into a box breathing. And I normally go around that box 4 times. A box breathing, may be familiar with that, but just to clarify, it's basically an even count breath between an inhale hold, an exhale, and an exhale hold. You're going around the box. It's an even sided breath. Typically go 5-second inhale, 5-second hold, 5-second exhale, 5-second hold. I go around there 2 times. And then I end this 3-part Huberman sequence, as I call it. I end with cyclic sighing. So it's just a deep inhale, and then a very sharp and quick exhale through my mouth. And I do anywhere between 5 and 10 of those. And then after that last exhale, I typically hold my breath after the exhale, and I just feel my body. I feel where the energy is flowing, because typically doing something like this, it starts to move some energy around. So I like to just observe that. And then after I've held my breath for as long as I can, I take a deep inhale and I just hold my breath in that moment. I feel my heart rate increase back up, and I kind of feel energized, stick out my chest. That might sound complicated, especially when you throw in the fact that I enjoy doing that in front of the sun every morning to get kind of
that's even better.
The sun rays. And so I may go through that sequence 2 to 3 times. So again, just to kind of put a button on that, that is the physiological sigh 4 times, box breathing, go around a box 2 to 3 times. And then I do a series of cyclic sighing, maybe 5 to 10 of those breaths into a breath hold, and then take a deep recovery breath after that breath hold. And then I go into a deep meditation for maybe 5 to 10 minutes, because that really centers myself and gets me present. And
I love it. And you do that in the morning, I suppose. That's part of your morning ritual.
That is part of the sacred morning. I try to do that every morning. The other additions are doing Duolingo, because I'm learning Spanish, and then I do push-ups. So there you go. That's my morning.
That's Anthony's morning
routine.
Thank you.
Yep.
Is there anything else that you want people to know or that you want to share before we wrap up today?
Well, I guess some parting words or things that you can dive into if you're interested in this. So I do have some guided exercises that are available on YouTube, for example. So now you have your CO2 tolerance test. If you're curious on how maybe you could improve that test, you could do something like a breathe light. And I have guided tutorials of that on YouTube. And you can find our YouTube at Recal Travel. So if you just, YouTube
And we'll
search
link it
Recal
too.
Travel. Yep. If you want to link that. I also have had the habit over the last 2 years of hosting a Monday morning breathwork training, which is not necessarily high altitude specific training. It's sort of a mindfulness practice using breathwork based coaching. And so you could dive into some of those episodes if you're curious about what breathwork could do for you and how you could feel just doing a Monday morning breathwork session. They become recordings. You can do them whenever. And of course, we're throwing content as much as possible and as useful as possible out on Instagram channels at Recal Travel, or you can follow me at Anthony Larubio. That's my last name is with one R and two B's, Lourbio. That's the Italian ancestry there. And parting words, I want to tell everybody out there to shut their mouth. Breathe through the nose, breathe slow, and breathe low for most efficient and most optimal breathing habits.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Anthony. This was really fun.
Likewise, I had a lot of fun, Lisa.